does the Enneagram have to do with this political climate? Our identities in following Jesus? A lot, actually. So in fact, it has a lot more to do than what we can imagine. If you've moved on from the Enneagram, we encourage you to look again. If you're nervous about the Enneagram, check out this renewed approach that puts theory in its proper place as a helpful tool for discipleship within community. So today we are really pleased to have a conversation with AJ Sherrill, who's a pastor and the author of The Enneagram for Spiritual Formation. And so we're really excited that we can learn and discover how that's helpful for us. Today, our time together is sponsored by the V3 movement, the church planting movement, and we are really happy to be sponsoring this webinar. In particular, we want to feature, we have an immersion, which is a shorter experience, a taste of what we offer about when we're, and this one is sponsored by forming a fivefold leadership team. So if you are interested in knowing what it means to have a polycentric leadership team, one that represents the different aspects and personalities and proclivities represented within APEST, we want to encourage you to definitely check us out. We have a shorter taste of that available. You can learn more about it on our app or going to our website at thev3movement.org or going through our app. So today, as we dig into the idea of the Enneagram for discipleship, we're going to discuss how the Enneagram is more than a personality test. We're going to learn about how this tool can become a discipleship instrument and how ministry leaders can implement spiritual formation and also discern what role that the Enneagram has in your church life. To lead us in today's conversation, we'll be hearing from AJ Sherrill, who has a DMin from Fuller Theological Seminary. He served as the lead pastor for churches across the country, including Mars Hill Bible Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's an adjunct professor and at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he teaches popular courses on transformational preaching and the Enneagram. And then he has released this new book through Baker Books, and it's called The Enneagram for Spiritual Formation. It comes out in just 6 days on September the 15th. So we're really glad to have him with us again. And then, of course, Dan White Jr., who's a full-time consultant and coach with the V3 movement, church planting movement, and he leads coaching cohorts around the country through a 9-month system for movement and mission. And so the V3 movement has coached over 200 faith communities over the last 5 years around life-forming discipleship, boundary crossing mission, locally rooted presence, and tight-knit community. He co-founded the Praxis Gathering, which is a yearly conference that focuses on innovation and immersion in discipleship. And of course, he has written a book, Love Over Fear, which is really helpful right now about how we can face monsters, befriend enemies, and heal our polarized world, as well as he co-authored The Church's Movement. And so we are really glad to join you today. And I am Lori Ruffin. I am the operations manager with the V3 movement and founder of the COO team. And with all of that said, I am going to pass us over to AJ, who will share with us how can we leverage the Enneagram for spiritual formation. Take it away, AJ.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Dan and Tanya and the V3 team. I've been able to do an event or two with V3, and I just love this organization. I love what y'all stand for. I love the way you're wanting to see the church move around the world and to be the church and to be the feet and hands of Jesus in every culture for the sake of that culture. And so my name is AJ Sherrill, and I most recently have moved to Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know if there's any Southerners here. I see people all over the world that are sort of eavesdropping on this conversation. Really thankful for all of you. We've recently moved back to the South from where we're from. I married a Georgia girl a long time ago, and since then we've lived in LA and New York and Grand Rapids. And now we're in Charleston trying to make a long-term home here. I pastor a charismatic, egalitarian Anglican church. And so we love the Holy Spirit. We love liturgy. We love empowerment for both men and women. And we're really learning a ton around multiculturalism and what it means to take the next good and right steps to be the church for all. So I got into this work with the Enneagram probably a decade ago or so. I was studying in my doctorate with a monk named Richard Rohr, and at his home, he was riffing on something and got into the Enneagram, and I just said, whoa, wait, what is that? Pentagram? What are you talking about? He's like, no, it's not witchcraft, although some think it is. And so he went into these 9 types. And, I've taken the Myers-Briggs, I've taken DISC, I've taken Strengths Finders. There are so many good personality tools out there. And I'd never heard of the Enneagram. And what set it apart for me was that it really got into my motives, not my behaviors. Most personality theories get into what, like, you remember that glacier with, the rock on top and then underneath the waters, like the majority of the actual matter of the stone or the ice or whatever. I realized that I was really aware of my behavior, but not really aware of why I did what I did. And it started naming things for me. And I was like, holy smokes, this is really embarrassing. I lead workshops around the world on this stuff, and it is without fail, someone will cry during the sort of typing part of the Enneagram because it feels like someone is reading your laundry or someone is reading your journal. And it can lead people to shame if you're not careful. It can also lead to all sorts of restoration and formation. And so I got into the Enneagram, just started studying it for personal development. And then I started asking some questions. Like, for example, I studied with, before Ian Cron and Suzanne Stabile came out with their seminal book on the Enneagram called The Road Back to You, I was doing some trainings with them. And I said to Suzanne at a break, I said, hey, listen, who's doing work on formation in the Enneagram? This was probably 7 years ago. And at the time she said, nobody. And so I ended up doing my dissertation on that because I was interested in this. In the church, we often try to batch spiritual formation. In other words, we say things like this: read your Bible, come to church. Remember when we used to do that pre-COVID? Come to church, pray, and maybe give some money. And in 30 years, you'll be transformed. I think most people that have been in the church for 30 years don't feel transformed. They just feel older. And I started wondering if we're not actually helping people think about how spiritual formation is really tied to our unique personalities, and how by the way, there's so many different ways to pray. There are many different ways to read the Bible. There are many different ways to serve the church and give. It's not just money, but time and all sorts of things. So it's like, how should we be thinking about spiritual formation when it comes to how God has made our personalities and ways that we can be challenged uniquely within our personalities to grow into greater Christ-likeness? So that was sort of the thesis of what my heart has been for the last 5 to 7 years of leading workshops, is helping the church not only type, but also moving beyond their type into formation, of pairing their type with spiritual practices that are going to form them, that are going to, first of all, affirm them in practices that come easy for them, but also challenge them in practices that they would just soon avoid. Like, for instance, I was just talking to Lori before this. We both identify as, well, I'll say this. I won't say this for you, Lori, though I just kind of did. I identify as a 3. Although you have all types in you, I identify most as a 3. And this COVID season has led me to really reinvestigate contemplative practices, because I like to achieve, to perform, to be successful, all this stuff. And COVID has shut a lot of my control around those things down. And so much of my formation this season has been God inviting me to consider surrender, greater amounts of solitude, greater amounts of stillness, and things that I wouldn't normally gravitate toward. So here's how I start every workshop out. And if you are someone who is a bit well-versed in the Enneagram, we're not going to go through all the types today. There are many books, free online resources, things you can buy for that. What I do want to do is talk about 4 rules that I would give you personally. And if you lead this stuff, or if it's a part of your church, I want to give you 4 rules you need to pay attention to. And then I want to look at one of the 9 types and talk just about that type. I want to talk about spiritual formation. I want to talk about the Bible and the biblical narrative you can pair with that type. And I also want to talk about the time of year and spiritual practices that you should be paying attention to. So this is what I do in my new book coming out next week for all the types. And it's really a Jesus-centric perspective into each of the types and how we can grow more whole into Christ-likeness. So let me start with 4 rules, because I think it's important that we get these out of the way in order to protect the integrity of you as a person and also your church or organization. Let me start with what the Enneagram is not. Rule number 1, reclaim the Enneagram not as an end, but as a means. So many people are using the Enneagram to either put people in a box or to shrink themselves down, or to think that the goal of the Enneagram is just to type yourself and that's it. That barely scratches the surface. The Enneagram merely gives you information about yourself so that you can do something with it. I remember Adele Calhoun, a great spiritual formation leader, she told me a couple of years ago, she said, if you're not working your number, the Enneagram's a waste of time. Because it's not just about seeing the Enneagram as an end. It's about seeing it as a means to more, to transformation. By the way, I'll make this distinction too. Well, in this next one, here's the next one. So if the first one is reclaim that the Enneagram is a means and not an end, the second thing is to remember that you are not a number. Your identity is so much more mysterious and complicated, and it's inspired and diffused with God's divine activity and identity over you. You are so much more than a number. That your personality is not the same thing as your identity. You are a beloved child of God, and there's nothing you can do about that. God loves you, that God loves you, that God loves you, period. But your personality is a strategy. It's not your identity. Your personality is a strategy. It's a strategy that you have developed over the course of time to both cope and thrive in a broken and beautiful world. And so a lot of the ways in which you show up in the world, you have learned. Some of them are genetic, but a lot of things throughout our lifetime, particularly I'm thinking from my life, middle school was a very formative time about just hard moments, right? And I strategized my way to survive and to thrive in middle school. High school's the same way. And so those first formative adolescent years, moving into your teenage years, those often can solidify what your core type will become. And so just remember that you're not a number. The third rule is to refuse to become that Enneagram church or that organization. Do not reduce the language, the way of being, the vision and values of your organization to the language of the Enneagram. And here's why. For those of us that operate in sort of gospel and kingdom-minded organizations, the gospel is hard enough to communicate. So to try to overlay it with all this other language that people have to get in order to be a part of who you are is just a very exclusionary principle, and it's not helpful for people coming in. It's one thing to have it operating on the back burner that people have become aware of. You don't want to bring that to the forefront where you're preaching using the Enneagram language, where all your small groups use Enneagram language. It creates an insider-outsider culture. And so just be aware of that as you bring the Enneagram to your life and to your organization, to your community. Be aware of ways that if you're not careful, it can inadvertently exclude people that are just trying to be a part of community. And so we don't want to complicate it for them. So reclaim that the Enneagram is a means and not an end. Remember you're not a number. Refuse to become that Enneagram church or organization. And the last is always resist the temptation to type other people. I'll never forget when Suzanne Stabile said to me, AJ, just because you know the Enneagram doesn't mean you know the person across the table, period. That was so helpful for me to realize, oh my goodness, like to shrink people down and to think that I understand. Because remember, the Enneagram is not a behavioral theory as much as it's a motivational theory. And that means this: two people, Lori and Dan, might be doing the same behavior, but for two very different reasons. That what's motivating their behavior is very different. And we can't just work with what's on top of the water, that glacier. The Enneagram is what's underneath, what's driving your behavior. And so it's very important that you resist the temptation to type others, because though you might see them act a certain way, they may not be doing that for the reason that you think. And that's why the Enneagram, I think, is so helpful for so many different reasons. So what I try to do in a lot of my workshops is I help people type and as quickly as possible. I want for people to type. By the way, one of the things Richard Rohr said to me, because I said, you know, what if I type evenly on some numbers with the test? And what if the people around me don't really know when I invite them to say, hey, what do you think? What if I see, you know, several types, several things that I see, well, that could be my core, or that could be my core. There's a couple of things I would tell you if you're in that camp. Number one, look at the wings, which is the types just to the right or to the left. And that will tell you if you find one of those wings that relate to your core more than others, that can really help you narrow down. But the one that Father Rohr told me back in the day that I've never forgotten, he said, AJ, it's the one that when you read it, gives you the greatest amount of humiliation. Like, oh my goodness, I hate this tool already, right? Who wants to do that? Who wants to be self-confrontational of looking at their own stuff and saying, I've spent my whole life trying to shove that under the rug. And now you're inviting me to pull that stuff out? Well, yeah, because what happens is when we begin to name things and we pull it out before the presence of a gracious and loving God, we can look at it apart from our identity and to say, yeah, that's a part of how I show up in the world. And I need to own that. I need to take responsibility for that. I need to see that transformed, but that's not who I am. And I want to deal with that in this time in my life so that I can grow more into the way of Jesus. So I'll help people type, and then I'll help people go into all of the transformative practices that can be helpful for their type. We'll lead into biblical narratives. We'll talk about evangelism. And I usually end by helping people create a rule of life. Because here's the thing, no one accidentally becomes like Jesus. If you are wanting to become more intentional with your spiritual life, it's not going to be because the pastor told you this, or you heard a podcast or whatever. That can be a part of it, but it's because you decided to take personal responsibility for your transformation. And you developed a rhythm, a way that you have chosen to be that's going to help you connect with the presence of God. And that's why spiritual practices matter. You can get really clear of what practices are going to help me actually expose my life to God's presence. And for some, it's nature. For others, it's reading. For others, it's intercessory prayer. For some, it's prophetic prayer, or it's stillness prayer, breath prayer. For others, it's all sorts. I mean, there's countless spiritual practices in the world. And there's just so many different ways to read the Bible. There's Lectio Divina, there's inductive Bible study, there's a 365-day plan of reading the Bible. So there's just different ways that jive with our personalities in different seasons that can help grow us in our formation. So those are the biggest things that I like to help people do, and for them to walk out with a rule of life. And that's a lot of fun. So what I want us to do over the next few minutes, and I'm going to go as quick as I can because I want to leave some time for questions and answers. I want to give you a quick typology. So I decided to choose the 8. I chose it indiscriminately. There's no reason I chose the 8. So if you're not an 8, don't be offended. If you are, don't be too prideful. You're not that special, though you probably think you are because you're an 8. I kid, but I'm sort of serious, but I kid. Let me read the 8 to you. Here's a description of what you might think of an 8. I'm independent. I'm a vigorous person who is comfortable taking the lead. I want to be respectful and respected, rather, for strength and dependability. And that is more important than being liked. I'm a no-nonsense go-getter who values honesty and faithfulness. I have no room for people who choose to be weak, but I will crusade for the one who is weak without choice. I will defend people I care about at any cost. I resist taking orders from people I don't respect or agree with. I will make my opinion known, my presence felt, and I will challenge the status quo. I want to fight injustice. I am direct, confrontational, decisive, and courageous in the heat of battle. I can create my own wars. Some people think I'm bossy, controlling, and needy, and ready, not needy, anything but, and ready to grab other people's power. I don't want them to have power over me. That's what I'm really after. And I'm also known for having the last word. What happens with eights is you're known as strong and confrontational, and you're probably the most misunderstood of all the types. Because again, it's not that you want control. It's that you probably learned somewhere in your life that it's not good to be under someone else's control. So you want to be on top as quickly as possible to spare you from that burden. You're typically a very intense person. You might be known by 10 people in your entire life. So it's also easy for you to be aggressive and not aware of your personality. The lie that's easy for you to believe is that it's not okay to trust just anybody. The truth that you need to hear is that you will not be betrayed. So anyways, that's just a little bit of typology. That's a just moment of diving into that. We won't belabor that. Many of you are probably already well-versed in the Enneagram. You can find more of that on the Enneagram Institute website for free. Also books from my books to Richard Rohr's to Ian and Suzanne's. It's all out there and it's really good stuff. What I do want to talk about for just a second is your practices. So if you're an 8, and I do these for all the types in my book. If you're an 8, first of all, your vice is lust. And that's not necessarily sexual. It's to say you're always going after the thing that just needs to be done, and you're active and engaged, right? And your virtue is to move toward innocence. Your downstream practice, which I call it upstream and downstream for your practices. I give at least one of each. Imagine you're about to sit into a lazy river on a raft. Your downstream is that practice that's going to come very easy for you, no effort. Your upstream is one that you're going to have to swim against the current and fight for, that you would rather ignore because it's hard. Now listen to this. Most of us do what we like, called downstream. We ignore what we don't, called upstream. And we call that following Jesus. That means that there is always parts of our discipleship that's omitted, that we're missing, because we only do the things we like. And so some of this work is about challenging yourself and saying, I need to do a practice or two that's not what I want to do. I need to be still before the Lord, especially as a 3 in this season, rather than performing and checking email as the first thing of my day. I've got to learn to be before I do. I've got to learn to abide and receive before I try to achieve anything in life. Very, very important to get that order right for probably all of us, but definitely for 3s. So back to the 8. The downstream practice for the 8 is easy. It's the common good. It's justice. It's protesting right now. It's non-violent ways of caring for the marginalized and the oppressed, right? Now the upside for you, the upstream, is going to be vulnerability. It's inviting people, a couple people, at least one person, to give you a 360-degree review of your life, to tell you without any consequence how you're showing up, how you're being perceived, how people are experiencing you. And that can be really hard because you might have been wounded and betrayed early in life. And so who can you trust that really loves you that's going to give you that kind of feedback? But 8s need to be able to confess and to be vulnerable. You need to find that person in your life who is strong enough. Most people, by the way, because you're a very strong person, which is a good thing, but because you're strong and can be intense, people can sometimes be a little intimidated by you. So you might have to invite someone in to saying, hey, would you just ask me these questions every season? Or can I ask you these questions about me and you give me honest feedback, knowing that no matter what you say, there'll be no penalty. We'll still be friends. I'll still love you. And I trust you. I think it's the Proverbs that say a wound from a friend can be trusted. Find that friend that you can say, help me see what I don't. And you can trust their wounds because you know you love them. The time the church year you need to pay attention to if you're into the liturgical calendar is Pentecost. And here's why. Because the Spirit of God descended and is renewing the world and cares about justice and renewal even more than you do. Sometimes 8s can feel like they're carrying the weight of the world and they've got to change the world, right? I love that impulse. However, God wants to see the world changed even more than we do. And he does it slowly but surely through the church, through people, through the world, through relationships, through friendships. And so what does it mean for you to say, I don't actually have to change the world on my own? God is all about justice and renewal. And I need to allow that anxiety to lift off my back, that anger and rage to lift off my shoulders, and to trust that if I just follow God and take the next step, that it is leading toward renewal. And the last thing I'll say here is about practice, or is about biblical narrative. I think right now we're dealing with a society that probably owns more Bibles and yet reads less Bibles. We probably have more Bibles sold today and less Bibles read today than ever before. And I think biblical literacy is going down. And part of the reason for that is that people see it as an ancient primitive text that has no bearing on my life. I would say this, though context has changed, times have changed, our motives are the same motives that our ancestors had around whether it's greed or whether it's desire or whether it's happiness, flourishing, lust, you name it. All of those motives have always been a part of the human story since God created the heavens and the earth. And so that being said, when we think about the Bible, there are ways in which I want to help people find their ancestors in the Bible that they can connect with and to say, oh, I do that too. And maybe it looks different in a 21st century world in New York City or in Singapore or in some farm in Kentucky or wherever you're from, but the motive is the same, right? And so when it comes to the 8, you should pay attention to the Syrophoenician woman, also known as the Canaanite woman. It's from the Gospels, where Jesus talks about this woman who shows up, and I believe it's her daughter that is sick. And this woman shows up at the feet of Jesus. It's a really weird narrative. He actually calls her a dog at one point. I mean, super offensive, really strange, kind of mystical. Like, why would Jesus do that? It's weird. But what I notice about her is that she is so passionate to fight for justice that she annoys Jesus until he does what she says. This is the type of person that will go to bat for her daughter, go to bat for her friends, go to bat for a cause that she believes in, and is willing to, she's tried everything, and she's willing to beg Jesus, to demand, Jesus, heal my daughter. That's the kind of, I mean, if you were a spectator at that table, you might say, hey, wait, back off, lady. Jesus is doing his thing. Give him some space. But when you see a justice issue that needs to happen, you are willing to risk your reputation, to fight for that, to be about that, right? And Jesus eventually, it's the strangest, most beautiful text. He does what she longs for. And I think that's a beautiful thing when we can pray and believe and seek and ask and move toward the justice that we seek in the world, and to know that our God is saying, I'm for that too. I'm going to do that in my time, but sometimes our times overlap, and I'm going to join you in the midst of that. And so the Syrophoenician woman, whenever I read that narrative, I think that's a way in which the 8 plays out. And that's a great narrative for the 8 to connect with. Not that she's an 8, because we don't have enough information to say that. Remember, we don't type other people, but we can see 8 characteristics come out in her. Okay, I'm out of time. They're telling me I need to stop. So let me pull back, take some questions, and let's have a conversation.
Thank you so much, AJ. I really appreciate the unique emphasis. I wish it wasn't so unique, but the emphasis on spiritual formation and moving beyond awareness into practices is really resonates with me a lot. So thank you so much for that, AJ. And on that, I have a question that's probably a little bit cranky, if I can ask.
We wouldn't expect anything less from you, Dan.
Yeah, my prophetic pastor piece coming out here. But so much of transformation, AJ, a beautiful concept of being formed and transforming into Christ is sitting in a context where we have, I was just reading this with some other research I was doing, that people literally read and take in 140,000 words within a week. So that we're in this context where we have so much information coming in. And then we have individualism, where most of that information, even Enneagram books that people are reading are within this individualistic, I'm consuming this, I'm getting awareness of myself. And part of my cranky question is how how do we move the Enneagram out of individualism, out of binging
Yes.
on information about ourselves? You know, so Dan White Jr. knows stuff about himself now, but I'm caught in this delusional nature that I can transform just by gaining awareness about myself without it moving into community, into confession, into. So I'm wondering how do we move it out of individualism and out of information binging into something that's generally a path towards transformation? And you've alluded to some of that, but that's,
Yes.
I feel it's caught in that vortex right now for many people.
Okay, here's the thing. The Enneagram is
Yeah.
also known as the 9 faces of the soul. The idea is that they're not the 9 faces of God, as some would say. In other words, God is, though we have God's image, we do not fully express God's personality and characteristic alone in the world. And so the Enneagram from the very get-go is the reminder that I can display God's image to the best of my ability, but that I need others to display the fuller picture of God to the world. So it actually is a tool to say we actually need the church to display a fuller picture of the divine than we are able to do alone. Now, does that mean we're not able to give shards of light of who this God is alone? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But it does mean that your picture of presenting God to the world will always be limited with the individualist mindset that God hasn't created us from the very beginning. We're called to community in Genesis 2. I mean, the first thing is it's not good for us to be alone, right? And I want to suggest that it's the same with spiritual gifts when you read 1 Corinthians 12, when you read Romans 12, that there is a sense that we are better to present God to the world together than we are apart. Now, the second thing I'll say about this is that leadership. There's a great book out there if you're a leader, you lead an organization, or just want to figure out team dynamics on differentiation, all that stuff. There's a great book out there by Beatrice Chestnut called The 9 Types of Leadership. And I took my staff through this, my executive team at Mars Hill when I was in Grand Rapids, because what I realized is that the way you are as a leader, as an individual, as a person, what happens is you expect that to be the normative way for everybody. So whatever motivates you or whatever behaviors you present, those are things that you think, oh yeah, this is normal. This is what everyone else are the weird ones. I'm the normal one, right? I remember showing up to a staff meeting and I'm a whiteboard guy, verbal processor. Let's get it out. Let's get team dynamics. Let's have some flow. Let's have some challenge. And I realized really quickly, like, I remember saying to my wife that night, I don't think my new staff like me because so many of them are quiet. They don't say anything. It's almost like they don't want to engage. And it wasn't until I really realized that many of them are 5s and 9s, that they need time to process. They need time to research. They need time to do critical thinking. And by the way, AJ, when they come back next week with an answer, it's going to be better probably than what you thought in the moment. And it was so helpful for me to see, like, oh my goodness, how helpful is this in community for me to see that you're not critiquing me in my leadership style. I still need to show up and be me, but I need to make space for you to be you.
That's great.
And differentiation is so helpful if you want to be excellent on a team.
So good. As a 5, that is really creates a lot of safety for me, just you saying that being understood that that's the way I process. I need that space. So that's really, really helpful. Thanks for that. I think we have quite a few questions that are coming in the Q&A. So Lori, would you like to ask some of those?
Sure, would love to. So one question that came in early, AJ, is that we are not supposed to type others. And I think you kind of knocked the wind out of a number of us listening who are really banking on that to be something to be helpful. And so the question is, if we are not to type others, how do we utilize the tool collaboratively with others? How does it help us navigate relationships?
Yeah, well, it's their journey to make. So if they invite you into typing, great, that can be helpful, but don't rob them of the joy of their own typing. And when you see that there is an amount of people around you that are interested in this same thing, then you can have those conversations and create that kind of deeper conversation. But you want to make sure that the people around you are affirming that they want to move in this direction and that they themselves are motivated. Like I have one person on my team right now that just couldn't care less on the Enneagram, doesn't even like it. And so there's never any coercion that you've got to speak like the rest of us to belong here. So let's just all choose to use the same language together. A lot of what I do is I just create opportunities for people that want to be attracted to those wells to come to, rather than assuming everyone's interested in this and let me overlay that on the community itself. Here's how I describe the Enneagram. It's not virtual reality. It's more like augmented reality. In other words, the idea isn't that the Enneagram needs to all take us into another world where we can then exist and be better. The idea is that the Enneagram, it just gives you information on your glasses. Imagine those Google glasses. It's augmented. It doesn't take you out of your reality. It just gives you more information about yourself and about ways other people want to reveal themselves, so that you can just have that knowledge when you're interacting, when you're in disagreement or you can't find your way forward. It just gives you increased knowledge to understand what might be underneath that, the whys. So I don't know that it's that complicated in that the answer to that question, other than just be aware of not coercing people into that, and then inviting people that at whatever level they feel free to make their type known. In fact, historically, like more than 5 minutes ago, I know history now has been truncated with social media and our loss of memories and storing everything on phones these days. Historically, because this tool's been around for thousands of years in one form or another, historically, you actually don't ask other people about their type. That's actually not something you go around knowing necessarily. But we like to talk about it, and I don't think it's a problem. But historically, it's really about yourself and about making sure that you are aware of your stuff so that you can heal and grow and just be aware of what you're bringing to the table. So, yeah. Feel free to add any of that, Lori or Dan, if anything comes up for you on that.
Sure. Well, thanks for that's a great direction. One, redirecting us towards kind of looking inward and not just focusing externally. Is there a spiritual practice that will bridge all the types? That's one of the questions that came up.
Yeah, so my friend John Mark Comer wrote a book last year called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which I think was something Dallas Willard once said to John Ortberg. I don't know, it's a long lineage of things. Can't keep it all straight. I'll say this. I think he was right about something, that we are all right now being capsized by chaos, noise, even with COVID. I know it's, for some of us, it's slowed down. If you're raising littles at the house, you feel like maybe life is ratcheted up with COVID. But I think what we're realizing is, even if you're in a place where even you're quarantined, the amount of noise, back to what Dan was saying about the amount of words and images that we see on a regular basis, we have got to figure out ways to give us more capacity in our neural pathways, because it is being choked out right now. Let me tell you what's happening right now in a pandemic, in a financial crisis. If you're an American, then you're experiencing a political crisis as well. And maybe wherever you are in the world, maybe something similar to that. What's happening is your brain is thinking to itself, I'm in constant stress. I'm constantly seeing the lion in the corner, right? To where, and Dan's done a little bit of this work, your neurons in your amygdala are expanding right now because you're constantly in fight or flight syndrome in your head. Your neurons in your hippocampus, which is where you store working memory, which is what you utilize, engage to get throughout a normal day, to think critically, to write, to have conversation. That's all working memory. Those neurons are shrinking. So when your amygdala neurons are expanding because you're in stress, your hippocampus neurons are shrinking. What it leads to is exhaustion. Everybody's tired. And not just physically, you're bone dry existentially, mentally, soul tired. And I would say what every type needs right now is contemplative practices. We've got to learn to still our frontal lobes, to find a sacred word or phrase, to find that chair or that nature walk, that beach, that mountain, that hill, that street that brings us inner calm, that river, that stream, that pond. And we've got to allow our minds to go up into a different altitude, because we're absolutely living just at ground level, and it's killing our working capacity, our creativity, our imagination, our prayer lives. And so that's a real issue right now. So stillness, silence, solitude, those 3 S's are massive.
That's awesome. Stillness, solitude, and
Silence.
silence. Awesome. That's really helpful. Earlier, you talked about downstream and upstream spiritual practices. Are there different times that you'd suggest leaning into one or the other, or is it worth regularly implementing both within our rule of life?
Yeah, be creative. Don't lock yourself in that, well, these are my two practices. This is all I ever do. It's like, it's amazing to me. And I think that's why I like the church calendar, is it gives us seasons to give ourselves permission to have different emphases in life. And I think that's also true for practices. So I would just be aware of what practices work really easily for you and what practices don't, and then explore why they don't, and see what might be underneath that actually it's hard, but it's a good hard, versus it's hard and there's a reason it's hard. It's because it brings me back to my childhood trauma and I need to see a psychiatrist really before I get into that sort of stuff. Keep it fresh. So if you find yourself getting stale in your quiet time or in your practices, switch it up. The last thing you want to be is legalistic, because here's the thing. It's not even about the practices. It's about the presence, because the presence is where the transformation happens in our spiritual journey. It's not about going through the motions, although sometimes you got to fake it till you make it, because that's just the way life is. It is about saying this practice is merely just a gateway to encountering the divine. So whatever that is, keep it fresh, but commit to it.
AJ, I have a question. Have you experimented or seen others experiment with creating like schools or like clusters where eights get together to contemplate a rule of life, to share their intelligence, where they're growing, play any kind of like coming together of around that shared number to seek transformation? Have you seen anything like that? Or
not necessarily like groups related to types necessarily.
Okay.
I do see that groups naturally develop out of workshops, because eventually, if they feel
Okay.
free to, I have them sit in tables, because what happens a lot is like, oh my goodness, you too? I thought I was the only one.
Right.
So that can be really healing and really helpful to know that you're not alone, especially if you're a
Yes.
4, because that's the tendency. I'll say this on September 15, when my book releases, on my Instagram, I'm featuring a personality and politics series where I'm hosting all the 9 types throughout the course of 9 days to talk about how they're showing up in this political moment within their type and ways that they are noticing health and unhealth. So let's just say you're a type 1 and saying, I need to hear from another type 1 how they're working this moment out. Like John Mark Comer, for example, is a type 1. He identifies with that. He's going to be on September 15th with me on my Instagram, just to kind of show this is how I show up, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of stuff can be helpful to where, like, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one feeling this. And even though my spouse or my partner, my boyfriend, girlfriend, or my kids or whatever might not identify with me at all, I know there are people out there that do identify with my type, and I can begin to have a conversation about that.
AJ, we've received a question around how does knowing our types help us know what to take off and what to put on? Is there a way that the Enneagram can help us unbecome so that we can become?
What a great question. I mean, that sounds like a Richard Rohr falling upward question. I can't help but think that this entire journey is about that. Like, it would be hard for me to say, well, here's the one part of the Enneagram, but I think the question you just asked, whoever you are, you really understand what this entire thing is trying to help you do. It's trying to help you name patterns that you have picked up throughout your life and called normal. And some of those are unhealthy, where you can begin to figure out, how do I let those go? And others of them are normal and beautiful, where you can figure out, how do I grow even healthier into this? I'll tell you this, I was golfing with a 73-year-old man yesterday. First time I met him. And he looked at me at around hole 16. And he said, my dad died when I was 12. And I'm still bitter. And I can't figure out how to heal that. It was so confessional. And I thought, wow. And he's just started to name that. And I said to him, hey, what do you think you could do to transform that bitterness? And he said, I don't know. See, he's just in the beginning of his journey of actually getting to a place where he can start to name what are some things I need to shed so that I can hold some other things. And the fact that you're asking that question means you're really far along the journey already. But the Enneagram will help you name. It's that humiliation. It's, oh my goodness, I've tried to conceal that my whole life. I now need to name that. Once you name that, you can bring it to a guided person that you trust. For me, it's my wife. And she helps me navigate, hey, what are my next steps of owning this, repenting of this, or saying, I reject this because this was put on me, to where you can move toward health and wholeness. But that question is very subjective, because there are certain things that you're going to find that you got to take off and others that you have to put on. And if you've not read Falling Upward, Roar's really talented in the psychology of that. I always say this, like Richard and I were good friends. We had many conversations in his office. I don't love his Christology right now, and that's okay, but I love his psychology.
Just following up on the idea that being aware of your number can make you feel a little bit more humiliated. This question is tied to, when you look at the deadly sin, it would seem that being transformed would feel in some way like being less like your number. So how do you reconcile that tension of being aware of your number, but then, and feeling kind of like the pinch of that, but then working on the unhealthiness of it and then gravitating towards a new number? Just how do you hold all of that?
Yeah, I will say that our default patterns probably don't change throughout our life. There are times that you go through things where you are being forced to present a different number, just because of life's demands and the ways that you gotta figure life out, right? But they do say that you resonate with your core, but again, you have all types in you. I think the goal for me is to become healthy with a 3-4 wing, but I also have begun to notice that all the types are in me. So I don't know that I have a cut and dried answer to that, other than when you pay attention more to your type and you move toward transformation, you begin to notice some other facets from some other types. But remember, you also have security and stress, those arrows on the Enneagram. So you're not just, from the very get-go, probabilistically, you're showing up in 5 different types from the get-go, because you have your wing, right? You have your security control. You have your subtype, which we won't come into, and then you have your type. So there's already a lot of different ways. Again, the human world is complicated. Back to Suzanne's statement, just because you know the person across the table doesn't mean, or just because you know the Enneagram doesn't mean you know the person across the table. There are so many different ways to show up, even per type. And so I am focused on growing into being aware of the ways that my 3 and 4 are unhealthy, and shifting those, because I think because I have a proclivity to default to those in my unhealth, those are the ways that glare out to the world most when I'm unhealthy, where I'm overreactionary. Or for some of you, you go over into flight mode. So I would just spend time in your type and your wing. And as you do that more and more, and as you transform that, I don't typically show up as an unhealthy 9, right? When I do show up as a 9, it's usually healthy. So the ways that I show up into the numbers, other numbers, are typically more healthy than not. It's the way that I show up in my core and my wing that can often lead to really unhealth. So focus on those.
Mm-hmm.
AJ, I have a quick question. You've mentioned a couple times a rule of life, or a rule and rhythm of life, as possible like instrument of transformation. Can you share a little bit of like what that could look like, or how that can be formed, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Here's what I do. I look at 3 categories. So imagine you come up with your practices. Let's say you have 4 different practices. And those don't have to be long and complicated. One of my practices is simply ringing a bell in the morning, because that gets my ear attuned that the presence, it's like a butler that rings the bell. And all of a sudden the presence comes and attends. It's the same thing with the Lord, that actually the Lord's ringing the bell and I'm showing up to be summoned into the presence of God. So that's one of I just ring the bell, and that calls me to my morning readings and prayer time. So don't be overly complicated with it. But I look at 3 categories: solitude, community, and ministry. And these are Henri Nouwen's categories. So am I
Yes.
spending time engaging the presence in solitude, right? That could be just a walk in nature. It also could be reading the Bible. It could be praying. There's tons of options, right? Adele Calhoun's Spiritual Disciplines Handbook will give you a ton of different practices. Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline, Dallas Willard, all those resources that are out there. If you're like, I only know 2 practices, it's like, there's like thousands of them, right? So solitude, community. Am I moving toward people or away from people? Are there a group of people in my life that know me, that I'm moving toward, that I'm intentionally having rhythm? That might be once a week, it might be once a month, but it's there. It's in my rhythm that I'm going to show up and have dinner with these people. I'm going to be with these people in this way, in a meaningful way, not just talking football or the weather or something like that. So solitude, community, and then ministry. Am I myself moving out into the world somehow to love my neighbor as myself, right? So when you look at your practices, it's helpful for me to then say, okay, how holistic are my practices? Are they all about solitude all the time? That might be an A, you're a very high introvert. It also might mean B, you're a narcissist, right? I mean that tongue in cheek. But I mean,
Thanks.
it's easy to come up with all sorts, the 5 there. It's easy to come up with all sorts of practices and to realize, oh my goodness, these are all just about me being alone with God. That's good. But there's also a gift that you need in community that God wants to give, and a gift through you that God wants to give to the world through ministry. So it doesn't all have to happen tomorrow as well. Give yourself, that's why I like to look at the long arc of the year,
Right.
where you can emphasize certain things. That's why we have
Yes.
Lent. What does Lent do? It takes you into deep interiority. What does Pentecost do? Deep service to the world as the Spirit goes out, right? So you have these times of the year that really ebb and flow with your spiritual journey. So I just check in periodically throughout the year and say, Lord, throughout the year, am I consistently ministering to someone somewhere? Am I with people at some level? And am I pursuing you in solitude? Those are my 3 grids.
That's great.
AJ, could you say more about the liturgical year? Some of us have come from less liturgical traditions, and that was a question following up with what you referenced.
Yeah, I don't come from the liturgical year too. So if that's you, I understand. I came into it later and started to realize that so much of my spirituality was just about spontaneity, that God can only move through the spontaneous. How dare we have anything planned out? And I learned that God does both, right? And so the church year, the calendar is designed, I'm in the Anglican tradition. The Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, Episcopalians, a lot of these traditions have sort of said, okay, it goes back to the omitting thing. We're good at things that we like and we omit the rest. The omission in the life and ministry of Jesus, most of us quote Bible verses that support whatever we already believe. The liturgical year exposes you to the entire life and ministry of Jesus throughout the course of the year. It starts in Advent and it ends, through the next November through ordinary time. So you go through Advent, Epiphany, there's Christmastide there too. Advent, Christmastide, Epiphany, Lent, and then you'll go through Easter, Eastertide, Pentecost. You go through this whole year of the life and ministry of Jesus. It starts at his birth, it ends in ascension. And it takes you through the life and ministry of Jesus to make sure you're understanding the full arc. The way I like to say it is that the first season is about God with us. Well, what does Advent mean? What does Emmanuel mean? It means God with us. The second part, Lent, is that God is for us. This God that when we confront ourselves in the wilderness, we realize God is for us. That goes through Good Friday, where God ultimately was for us on the cross. And then on Easter through Eastertide, that is that God is with us. Or excuse me, God with us, God for us, God is in us. That God has ascended and resurrected so that the Spirit could come live within us. And then the rest of the year, this Pentecost, the ordinary time, is God is through us, right? God with us, God for us, God in us, God through us. That is the Christian life. And I think that's the liturgical calendar.
Wow, what a beautiful, succinct way to articulate that. What do you say for someone who hasn't tested or done the assessment in a while? Should they retest? And is it something that we should revisit, at different points in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, not if you already know your type. You don't have to go back to testing any more than you need to go back and learn your addition tables. You know what I mean? A lot of people test and they can't quite solidify. I look at that as a funnel. Start with testing, and tests are helpful to get you in a range. I would be very cautious to put all of your eggs in the testing basket. From that, move into a place where you can bring community into it. Say, hey, what do you see here? What do you sense here? What do you, then look at your wings if you've narrowed it down to a couple. And then ultimately it's the humiliation one that brings you into the real core of who you are. So if you're like, hey, I tested a while back, I'm pretty clear that I'm a 4. Should I go back and take the test? Maybe, but probably not. Although I will say a lot of people give testimony to mistyping for years. Like I remember my friend David Gonger, who's an artist that you might have heard his art before. He's a wonderful musician. He once was so sad. We were out to lunch and he was just lamenting the fact that he spent like 3 years mistyped. He was like, it doesn't really matter, but it's helpful. So if you want to go back and test again, you can. I'm not sure you necessarily need to if you know your type and you're moving deeper within that. Because remember, the typing yourself is just the beginning. Like the goal isn't to continue to come back to that. It's to move beyond that into greater self-awareness. And probably at some point in your maturation journey, you can let type go because it's just not the ultimate game. Jesus is, right? So the more you begin to know yourself, the more you don't even need to say I'm a 4. It's like, well, yeah, I just know my tendencies.
Sure. AJ, I've got one question. I'd love to get your 30-second answer. What is one thing about the Enneagram that you know now that you wish you knew or that you learned earlier on in your journey?
Let me keep it succinct. It's not Jesus. Jesus is the answer, not the Enneagram. That's what I want everyone to know.
That's good.
Amen.
Drops the mic.
Yeah.
Well,